They were involved. And the reason we find in Deuteronomy chapter 29, verse 9 to 19. In this text, the Deuteronomist acknowledges a woman as equal partner in the covenant community with a man. Consequently, the woman can assume full responsibility in the community. Therefore, a scholar by name Mary Evans holds that a woman had a significant role to play in the life of the nation, not only in their role as a mother in the home, but also individuals were not barred from the leadership when the circumstances required it. The text of Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 21. Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 21 comes in the context of the Decalogue. The Decalogue is indeed in the heart of the Old Testament scriptures. Its centrality can be emphasized in terms that among all the laws, it was the only law that is being emphasized that was given directly by God. Another reason to emphasize the centrality of the Decalogue comes in the context of the covenant. And you realize that the centrality of the covenant cannot be emphasized. There are many questions that exist in regards to the issue of the Decalogue. What we can note is that the Decalogue has a long prehistory of development, and this actually can be demonstrated by the motive clauses. And today we know that the present place where the Decalogue is could not have been the original places where the Decalogue was. Now, the Decalogue in Deuteronomy has its parallel in Exodus. Now, these parallels have interesting differences. I will look at a few. The first difference that I want to look at is with regards to the Sabbath observance. When you look at the Exodus experience, they are told to observe the Sabbath because God rested. Actually, the account goes back to the story of creation. So the motive we can clearly see that is theocentric, God-centered. But when you look at its parallel in the book of Deuteronomy, the motive expressed is that they must remember that once they were slaves. Now, the motive switches from being theocentric to being anthropocentric, people-centered. It draws from the experience of the people. And the Israelites are being reminded that they must remember that once they were slaves, and they didn't like it. Going forward, they ought to become liberators. The second aspect, which is the focus of this paper, is the last commandment. If you look at the framing of the last commandment, we will look at the Exodus version. The ordering begins with a house, then a woman. Of course, all those are properties of a man. The focus is on safeguarding, so they should not covet. First of importance is the house, in that order with a woman. But when you turn to our text today, which is Deuteronomy, you find that two different verbs are used. But before we go to the two different verbs, we see a change of order. Indeed, the Deuteronomistic writer begins with a wife. And that's not accidental. It shows the value, the priority that this writer places on the woman. And to further distinguish the woman from other properties of a man, the verb covet is used of a woman. But when it comes to other things, the verb desire is employed. And this writer indeed wants to point to the distinctive nature of a woman. We must, from this consideration, note that a woman can never be compared with other properties. A woman is indeed a relational being who can react, who has emotions, and has feelings at that much. There have been attempts to read this commandment as two, to divide them. And some scholars have argued that to divide these commandments will equal to depersonalizing a woman. So the implication of this reading, I want to conclude by noting that the Deuteronomistic corpus elevates the status of a woman. A woman in the Deuteronomistic corpus has rights and shares to that equal rights as a male counterpart. The Deuteronomistic writer, apart from elevating the woman, also distinguishes her from other properties that a man has. And that has something to tell us in the African society. You know, in some African society, we think once we have paid dowry, a woman is reduced to the cows. A woman can never be equal to animals or cows. A woman is a distinct being. We need to respect women and give them chance to participate in all roles of society equally as their male counterparts. We must stand and fight against any discrimination against a woman. Thank you for listening to me, and God bless you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Maurice Owinyo, for that enlightening presentation. Can we give him another crowd praise? Our next presenter is supposed to be Sister Dr. Margaret Alingo. Is not around, but somebody is going to present on her behalf. Control room, please, could you project the presentation of Sister Margaret Alingo? Sister Margaret Alingo is a teacher at Tangaza University in Kenya.
Okay, I'm going to do a presentation, and the title for our presentation is Voices from the Shadows, Reclaiming Agency and Justice in Biblical Text of Terror. I say I'm going to do our presentation because in collaboration with Sister Ringo, we are working on this paper. So, in our introduction, when we say biblical text of terror, when we refer to Ferris Treble of 1984, She is the first person to use this term, whereby she described the text of terror in the scripture stories marked by violence, particularly the gendered violence. They often lack redemptive closures, leaving victims silent, voiceless, and nameless. In terms of the ethical and theological questions, these narratives raise profound questions about divine justice. Therefore, they also challenge the readers to consider issues of human dignity. The silence and nameless of victims highlight ethical dilemmas. In the modern justice movements frameworks, we have the movements like the Me Too. The Me Too is a movement that it gained its momentum in 2017, whereby they were talking about the issue of patriarchal structures in the biblical stories and also the colonial oppressions. When we talk about the Black Lives Matters, it was talking about the issue of the issue of racism, police brutality, and the evaluation of the Black lives. But in this case, we are not going to focus on the Black Lives Matters and the Me Too. We are going to look at the African theologists, feminist theologists. So in the hermeneutics of suspicion and liberation, critical interrogation of biblical texts, feminist and liberation hermeneutics critically interrogate biblical texts to uncover the silence, voices, and lost agencies. Therefore, a scholar by the name Elizabeth from Germany, in the hermeneutics of suspicion, view the texts of terror as murder scenes, revealing the repressed narratives through creative engagement. In the roots of liberation theology, liberation hermeneutics, rooted in Latin America theology and expanded by the African feminist theologians, emphasizes scriptures can call to address structural injustices, gender violence, and poverty. In terms of challenging these hegemonic readings, this approach challenges the hegemonic, colonial, and androcentric readings by asking several questions, which goes by, whose voices are missing? Then, there is also the question which says, whose silence is being served? Then, where is their voices? Move to the next slides. Next. 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 Okay, now in the transformation interpretations, this study fosters transformative interpretations that prioritize the lived realities of the oppressed and envision the scripture as a source of resistance and flourishing. There are several texts of terror in the scriptures that this study cannot examine, but in this case, we are going to look at different case studies. In the next slide, we have the Levite concubine in Judges chapter 19, verse 15 to 29. In this narrative of the Levite concubine, it is marked by extreme violence and silence. She is unnamed, voiceless, and reduced to a political system. The patriarchal control and brutal abuse, whereby her journey is controlled by patriarchal authority, it culminates in brutal abuse and dismemberment, inciting national outrage. The story revealed gendered power dynamics, and religious silence. These dynamics devalue female life and perpetuate system injustices. Therefore, the African feminist theologist resistance advocate for the imagining of her voice, the Levite concubine's voice, whereby they also aim to reclaim her story and challenge the liturgical silence. In terms of the ethical reflection on communal memory, her narrative demands ethical reflection on communal memory. It also calls for the re-evaluation of representation and the societal values. Next slide. Next. And we find that the African feminist theologians, they critique the educational and liturgical uses that perpetuate the silence. They emphasize the importance of reclaiming her story for justice. Then we have the second case of Dinah's defilement in Genesis chapter 34, verse 1 to 4. Dinah's story involves sexual violence, silencing, and political negotiation. Her narrative is often victim-blamed for going out, but the feminist scholars reject this perspective. The perspective of the African feminist theologians, scholars who view Dinah's action as social inquiry rather than the moral failure. This perspective challenges the traditional interpretations of her story. In silencing and mediation of the trauma, Dinah remains silent throughout her story. She doesn't reveal her story to anyone, despite being forced to. Her trauma is mediated and narrated by male voices, highlighting gender dynamics. The ethical questions on retaliation, whereby the violent retaliation by Dinah's brother raises ethical questions in Genesis chapter 34, verse 18 to 31. It also prompts reflection on cycles of violence and justice. And therefore, the African feminist theologians emphasize communal healing through naming, storytelling, and also ritual systems. They frame Dinah's narrative as one of survival rather than shame. In reclaiming Dinah's agency, it requires rereading and retelling her story. This process in liturgical and pastoral contexts aim to restore dignity and also promote justice. Tamar's trauma and royal justice in 2 Samuel chapter 13, verse 1 to 22. Tamar was the king's daughter who suffered sexual violence at the hands of her half-brother Ammon. Her resistance is clear and courageous, appealing to legal and moral norms. Despite her efforts, her voice is ultimately overwhelmed. In 2 Samuel chapter 13, verse 12, which says, "No, my brother, do not shame me. That is an intolerable crime in Israel. Do not commit the insensate deed." In the failure of justice, we find that the narrative exposes failure of familial, royal, and divine justice. King David's anger is passive and also insufficient. In 2 Samuel 13, verse 21. Institutional complicity exacerbates Tamas trauma. The absence of supernatural intervention, the narrative offers no supernatural intervention or effective justice. Tamas' plight highlights the lack of divine action in her defense. This absence underscores the depth of her suffering. Therefore, in the perspective of the African feminist theologists, they interpret Tamas as a symbol of defiance and grief. They urge advocacy, pastoral care, and theological renewal. Tamas' story inspires calls for justice and healing. In the reclamation of Tamas' agency, it involves acknowledging her trauma. Amplifying her voice is essential to her empowerment. And moreover, there should be also creating spaces for healing and justice, which is a critical step forward. Symbolism and advocacy. Tamas' story serves as a powerful symbol for advocacy. Her narrative encourages theological reflection and also renewal. It calls for action to address systematic injustices and support the survivors. In our fourth and last case study, reclaiming Hagar, in Genesis chapter 16, verse 1 to 15, and also in Genesis chapter 21, verse 8 to 21. Hagar, an enslaved Egyptian woman who occupies a marginalized position, yet emerges as a prophetic and resilient figure. Exploitation and agency, coerced into surrogacy without consent, her body is exploited, but her flight into the wilderness marks a moment of agency. Divine encounter, God's direct encounter with Hagar, addressing her by name and promising numerous descendants, affirms her dignity and significance independent of patriarchal figures. Symbol of the marginalized women. African feminist theologians embrace Hagar as a symbol for marginalized women facing exile and exploitation. In the liberative emblem, her story calls for honoring her voice, vision, and vocation, transforming her from a biblical footnote into a liberative emblem of survival and divine providence. Therefore, the following are the trauma-informed hermeneutics, healing through the reinterpretation. Number one, we have the integration of discipline. This involves disciplines such as the psychology, pastoral care, and feminist theology to engage biblical text of horror with sensitivity. Then there should be also the validation of the survivor's experience. This approach validates survivor's experience by naming and condemning violence rather than spiritualizing or minimizing it. There should also be respect for the fractured voices. This is whereby we recognize the voices and the ambiguous narratives, trauma-informed hermeneutics, respect uncertainty, and resist the imposed closure. Healing through reinterpretation. Reinterpretation becomes a healing tool, restoring agency through contextual readings, liturgical lament, and imaginative expansions. There should also be communal healing practices. Through the African feminist theologians, incorporation of the communal healing practices like songs and storytelling will inform and liberate the traumatization that was caused by the voices, people who have not, whose voices have not been heard. Transformation of the scripture. These practices transform scripture from source of re-traumatization into one of resilience, hope, and restoration. The contextualization of the agency and the resistance by the African feminist theologists. Reclaiming biblical interpretations, whereby African feminist theologists reclaim biblical interpretations from the patriarchal, colonial, and Eurocentric frameworks. It centers African women lived experience as a foundation for theological reflection. Validating African traditions. This theology validates oral traditions, proverbs, and rituals as legitimate theological sources. It also emphasizes communal and embodied agency in its approach. Then there is need for connecting biblical and contemporary struggles. African feminist theology links biblical violence with modern issues such as economic marginalization, spiritual silencing, and gender-based violence. It also advocates for healing hermeneutics that empower rather than harm. Critiquing ecclesial structures. It critiques exclusionary ecclesial structures that perpetuate inequality. The theology calls for systematic reform and inclusive leadership within the religious institutions. There is also need for advocating intersexual activism. The African feminist theology promotes intersectional activism to address overlapping systems of oppression. It seeks to create pathways for systematic change and justice, transforming scriptures into hope and resistance. This theology transforms scriptures into a source of hope, justice, and collective resistance. It also reimagines the biblical texts as tools for empowerment and healing. Therefore, from those insights, we draw different perspectives and give out various conclusions towards a liberative canon and ethical praxis, whereby, number one, we can talk about the reclaiming agency in the biblical texts. Reclaiming agency in biblical texts of terror demands more than scholarly interpretations, as it requires pastoral sensitivity, ethical commitment, and structural transformation. African feminist theology as a framework. This offers a powerful framework that grounds interpretation in lived experiences, cultural memory, and communal healing. The dynamic nature of the liberative canon, which is shaped by the ongoing dialogue and justice concerns. The ethical practice for justice and healing. This involves creating safe spaces for survivors, promoting inclusive leadership, and reforming the liturgical practices. There is also need for confronting sacred violence with empathy, as this courageous work confronts sacred violence, honors the silent voices, and fosters healing, affirming that light and agency emerge not by erasing suffering, but by illuminating it with empathy, creativity, and solidarity. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for that enriching presentation, highlighting some of the women that we tend to forget, and also giving us a direction on how we can go about them. a bit behind time, but we still have one more presentation. This is from Dr. Jane Nambiri. Jane is a research fellow in the Directorate of Research at the Catholic University of Eastern Africa. Is a specialist in educational research and evaluation. Her special interest is in human space, and the title of her work is What Does a Woman Want? So let's hear from Jen. Jen, you have 20 minutes. Control room, please.
Gana swere gana zindubutswa yanza welinde mama wechungene ndabanduba usaba yanza welinde mama wechungene ndabanduba tama